Jesus did not only warn his disciples once about deception and move on. He returned to it again and again, like a teacher trying to imprint something deeply into the hearts of his students. Because he knew something about human nature, people tend to fear the wrong things and ignore the most dangerous ones. So while the disciples expected Jesus to speak first about power, judgment, or glory, he instead begins with a quiet but weighty command. Matthew 24:4 says, "Take heed that no man deceive you." This is not spoken in excitement. It is spoken in seriousness. It is as though Jesus is leaning forward, lowering his voice, making sure they understand that what he is about to say is not optional knowledge, it is survival truth. And then he begins to unfold something deeply sobering. Deception will not be rare in the last days. It will be widespread, normal, and even expected. Jesus says, Matthew 24:5 says, "For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." The repetition of the word many is not accidental. It is a warning about scale. Jesus is not describing a small group of misguided voices on the fringe of society. He is describing a global spiritual condition where deception becomes common enough that it influences entire populations. What makes this even more serious is that Jesus says these deceivers come in his name. They will not announce themselves as enemies of God. They will not openly reject spirituality. Instead, they will attach themselves to the language of faith, the identity of Christ, and the appearance of truth. And this is where the danger becomes more subtle than persecution or obvious evil. Because persecution is easy to identify, deception is not. Persecution attacks the body. Deception attacks the mind and spirit. And Jesus knew that what confuses the mind can eventually lead the heart away from truth without the person even realizing it is happening. That is why he repeats this warning in different ways throughout his ministry. In another moment, he says, Luke 21:8 says, "Take heed that the be not deceived." Notice again the emphasis. Take heed. It is not passive. It is active. It requires awareness, attention, and spiritual alertness. Jesus is telling his followers that truth is not something that will always protect itself in a noisy world. It must be guarded within the heart. As he continues speaking, Jesus expands the warning beyond human teachers. He says that deception will not only come through people claiming to represent him, but also through signs, wonders, and powerful displays that look spiritual on the surface. Matthew 24:24 says, "For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect." This statement is one of the most sobering in all of Scripture. Jesus is acknowledging that deception in the last days will not be weak or easily dismissed. It will be persuasive. It will be supported by experiences that appear supernatural. It will carry emotional and spiritual intensity that can mislead even sincere people if they are not grounded. And yet, he adds an important phrase, "if it were possible." This reveals something crucial. To God will still preserve those who are anchored in truth. But the warning is clear. Without discernment, even strong believers could be pulled into confusion. This is why the early church carried this warning seriously. The Apostle Paul echoes the same concern when he writes. 2 Thessalonians 2-3 says, "Let no man deceive you by any means." Paul does not say deception might happen. He assumes it will happen. His concern is that believers must not allow themselves to be moved by it. And then he adds something deeper. Before the final unfolding of events, there will be a falling away, a drifting, a departure from truth that happens gradually, not suddenly. This is how deception often works. It does not usually remove truth in one moment. It replaces it slowly. It shifts perspective little by little. It changes what feels normal. It adjusts what feels acceptable. And over time, what once seemed unthinkable becomes familiar. Jesus understood this spiritual drift, which is why he anchored his warning not in fear, but in awareness. He was not trying to make his disciples paranoid. He was trying to make them awake. Because deception is most powerful where awareness is weakest. And this is where the message becomes deeply personal. Jesus is not only speaking to a future generation. He is speaking to every generation that would ever read his words. He is warning that truth will always be challenged not because truth is weak, but because the human heart can be easily influenced when it is not rooted. That is why he consistently points his followers back to one foundation, staying connected to his words, his teachings, and the truth of God. Later in John's Gospel, Jesus explains this protection more clearly. John 8:31-32 says, "If they continue in my word, then are the my disciples indeed. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Freedom, in Jesus' teaching, is not just freedom from external bondage. It is freedom from internal deception. It is the ability to recognize what is true when many voices are competing for attention. So when Jesus warns, "Be not deceived," he is not only predicting a problem. He is offering a path of protection. He is saying that truth is still available, still stable, still powerful, but it must be held onto intentionally. And as his prophecy continues, Jesus shifts from general warning to specific conditions that will make deception even more powerful in the world. Fear, confusion, global instability, and spiritual distraction. He describes nations in distress, people's hearts failing them for fear, and uncertainty filling the earth. And in that environment, deception thrives because fearful people often cling to anything that promises certainty, even if it is false. This is why Jesus' warning is not just theological, it is deeply practical. He is revealing how human psychology and spiritual vulnerability intersect in times of crisis. When people are afraid, they stop questioning carefully. When people are desperate, they stop testing what they hear. When people are overwhelmed, they become more willing to follow voices that sound confident, even if those voices are not grounded in truth. And so deception spreads not only because deceivers are active, but because discernment becomes weaker in times of pressure. This is why Jesus begins everything with one command: take heed. Because attention is the beginning of protection, and awareness is the beginning of truth. As Jesus continues to unfold the signs of the last days, his warning becomes even more intense. He moves from general deception into something far more specific and far more dangerous deception that carries power, influence, and supernatural appearance. He says in Matthew 24:24, "For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders." This is where the warning becomes deeply unsettling, because Jesus is no longer only talking about words. He is talking about experiences. He is talking about events that people will witness with their own eyes, things that will look spiritual, feel powerful, and appear convincing. False prophets are not described as confused people. They are described as active voices, leaders, influencers, and messengers who claim authority in spiritual matters. And Jesus says they will arise. That means they will not be rare. They will appear in different places, in different forms, across different times, increasing in visibility as the end approaches. But what makes this warning even more serious is not just their presence. It is their ability. Jesus says they will show great signs and wonders. This means deception will not always come through logic alone. It will also come through power, through experiences that feel real, through moments that stir emotion, awe, and even fear. And this is where many people become vulnerable. Because human beings naturally respond to what they can see and feel. When something looks supernatural, the mind often assumes it must be divine. But Jesus is preparing his followers to understand a critical truth. Not everything that is powerful is from God. He continues in Matthew 24:24 insomuch that, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. This phrase reveals the intensity of end-time deception. It is not shallow. It is not easily dismissed. It is persuasive enough that, if God did not preserve his truth and his people, even those who are sincere could be misled. This is not because truth becomes weaker, but because deception becomes more sophisticated. In every generation, deception adapts. It changes form. It learns how to imitate what people trust. In the last days, Jesus warns that deception will imitate spirituality so closely that it will require deep discernment to recognize what is genuine and what is false. And this is why Jesus repeatedly anchors his followers back to one thing, his word. Because experiences can be copied, emotions can be stirred, and signs can be imitated, but truth remains consistent. Later in Scripture, this same warning is reinforced by the Apostle Paul, who writes,
2 Coríntios 11:14 says Marvel.
For Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. This reveals something profound. Deception does not always come dressed in darkness. Sometimes it comes dressed in light. It does not always look harmful. It can look beautiful, spiritual, and even holy on the surface. This is why Jesus does not say, "Follow what looks powerful." He does not say, "Follow what feels spiritual." Instead, he consistently points his followers back to truth, obedience, and discernment. Because in the last days, feelings alone cannot be trusted as a guide. Jesus also warns in another place in Matthew. 7:15 says, "Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves." This imagery is powerful. Sheep's clothing represents appearance something gentle, familiar, and safe. Wolves represent danger and destruction. The warning is that deception often hides its true nature behind a harmless or even holy appearance. This means that in the last days, the greatest danger will not always be obvious opposition to God. It will often be imitation of God. And imitation is powerful because it is close enough to feel familiar, but different enough to lead away from truth. This is why spiritual maturity is not measured by excitement, but by discernment. As Jesus continues teaching, he warns that deception will also spread through influence, through people who speak confidently, gather followers, and appear successful. In many cases, truth will not be rejected because it is proven wrong, but because it is overshadowed by louder voices. This is a pattern seen throughout history. People are often drawn not to what is true, but to what is popular, persuasive, or emotionally compelling. Jesus is warning that in the last days, this pattern will intensify. That is why he says earlier in Matthew 24:4 says, "Take heed that no man deceive you," because deception rarely forces itself. It invites itself. It persuades. It attracts. It builds trust slowly until the listener no longer questions what they hear. And once trust is misplaced, deception no longer needs to work hard, it only needs to continue speaking. This is why the Bible repeatedly emphasizes testing what is heard. 1 Thessalonians 5:21 says, "Prove all things. Hold fast that which is good." Testing truth is not a lack of faith. It is obedience to wisdom. It is the spiritual responsibility of every believer who wants to remain anchored in what is real. As Jesus' warning continues to unfold, we begin to see a pattern. Deception in the last days is not random. It is structured. It moves through voices, through experiences, through influence, and through spiritual imitation. But beneath all of it lies one core strategy: confusion. Because where confusion increases, clarity decreases. And where clarity decreases, deception spreads more easily. This is why Jesus speaks with urgency. He is not trying to create fear, he is trying to create awareness. He is preparing his followers for a world where truth will not always be obvious, where spiritual voices will multiply, and where discernment will become essential for survival in faith. And yet, even in this heavy warning, there is a quiet assurance embedded in his words. Jesus does not leave his followers helpless. He does not warn them without direction. Every warning is also a call to grounding, anchoring in his word, staying spiritually alert, and refusing to be carried away by every new claim, experience, or movement, because deception only wins where truth is forgotten, and truth only remains powerful where it is remembered, held, and lived. As Jesus continues his prophecy on the Mount of Olives, the warning begins to move from the outside world into something even more personal. He is no longer only speaking about false prophets or external deception. He begins to describe what will happen inside the hearts of believers and even inside the community of faith. And this is where the warning becomes even more serious, because external deception is easier to recognize. But internal drifting happens quietly. Jesus begins to describe a condition of the last days that is not just about what people will see, but what people will become. He says in Matthew 24:12, "And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold." This verse is deeply important. Jesus is not only describing moral decline in society, he is describing a spiritual cooling, a loss of love, compassion, and sincerity among many. The word many appears again. Not a few, not an isolated group, but a large portion of people. And the process is gradual. Jesus says iniquity will abound. That means increase, spread, multiply, and become normal. As wrongdoing becomes more accepted, something begins to happen to the human heart. It becomes less sensitive. At first, love is strong. Faith is alive. Compassion is active. People care deeply about truth, about God, about righteousness. But over time, as deception spreads and iniquity increases, the heart begins to adjust. What once felt wrong starts to feel normal. What once felt heavy begins to feel light. What once caused conviction begins to cause indifference. And slowly, love grows cold. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. This is one of the most dangerous aspects of end time. Deception, not just false teaching, but emotional and spiritual numbing. Because when love grows cold, discernment also weakens. A cold heart does not perceive truth as clearly as a burning heart. A distracted heart does not recognize deception as quickly as a devoted one. This is why Jesus connects deception with love, because they are deeply related. Where love for truth weakens, deception gains entry. And then Jesus adds something that shows both warning and hope. Matthew 24:13 says, "But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved." This is not a statement about perfection. It is a statement about endurance. Jesus is revealing that the key challenge of the last days is not only believing truth once, but holding on to it over time. Endurance implies pressure. It implies resistance. It implies that faith will be tested, stretched, and challenged. And in that environment, many will drift. That is what Paul later calls a falling away. 2 Thessalonians 2-3 says, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there comes a falling away first." A falling away is not an explosion. It is a departure, a slow turning away, a gradual disconnect from what was once held firmly. And this is where deception becomes deeply subtle, because not everyone who falls away realizes they are falling away. It often feels like adjustment, growth, or change. But spiritually, it is a drift away from truth. This is why Jesus repeatedly emphasizes staying watchful, because spiritual drift rarely announces itself. It feels normal while it is happening. In another teaching, Jesus warns. Luke 8:18 says, "Take heed therefore how ye hear." Not just what you hear, but how you hear, because the condition of the heart determines how truth is received. A distracted heart hears but does not retain. A hardened heart hears but does not respond. A divided heart hears but is pulled in multiple directions. And in such conditions, deception does not need to force its way in. It simply finds space. This is why Jesus' warning is not only about external falsehood, but internal sensitivity. Because truth is not only something you hear, it is something you remain aligned with. As the prophecy continues, Jesus reveals another layer of end-time reality, global instability, fear, and uncertainty. He speaks of distress among nations, confusion in society, and fear rising in human hearts. And in that atmosphere, deception becomes even more effective, because fear weakens discernment. When people are afraid, they seek answers quickly. When they are overwhelmed, they accept explanations more easily. When they are uncertain, they are drawn to voices that sound confident even if those voices are not grounded in truth. This is why deception often increases in times of crisis. Not because crisis creates lies, but because crisis creates vulnerability. And Jesus, knowing this, warns his disciples ahead of time so they are not caught unprepared. He is not only telling them what will happen in the world, he is teaching them how to remain steady within it. Because truth is not only about information, it is about stability. And in the last days, stability will become rare. But those who are anchored in Christ will not be easily moved. This is why Jesus consistently points back to endurance, awareness, and truth. Not emotional excitement, not signs alone, not popularity, but steady faith rooted in His Word. Because deception thrives in instability, but truth thrives in endurance. And as this part of his teaching closes, a powerful picture emerges. A world filled with voices, confusion, shifting morals, increasing deception, and cooling love, but also a call to remain grounded, watchful, and anchored in truth. And Jesus makes it clear. Survival in faith will not depend on exposure to truth alone, but on remaining in it. As Jesus continues his prophecy, the scope of his warning expands from individuals and false prophets into something much larger, an entire world atmosphere shaped by instability, fear, and confusion. He is no longer only describing personal deception. He is describing a global condition where deception becomes easier to believe because the world itself becomes harder to understand. Jesus says in Matthew 24:6, "And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled." This is important because Jesus is not only predicting conflict, he is addressing the emotional reaction to conflict. He says, "See that ye be not troubled." In other words, do not let external instability produce internal collapse. Because when the world becomes unstable, the human mind begins searching desperately for explanations. And in that search, people become vulnerable to misleading voices. Then Jesus continues in Matthew 24:6, "For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." This statement is a stabilizing truth in the middle of instability. Jesus is teaching his followers that not every crisis is the end, and not every alarming event is the final moment. This is crucial because deception often grows stronger when people assume everything unusual is the final sign. Confusion creates urgency, and urgency creates vulnerability. When people believe this is it, they become less careful about what they believe. And that is where deception gains strength. Jesus then describes a world in increasing turmoil. Matthew 24:7 says, "For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences, and earthquakes in divers places." But notice something important. Jesus is not saying these events are deception themselves. He is saying they create the environment in which deception spreads more easily. Because when the world shakes, people begin to question everything. And when people question everything, they often stop testing anything carefully. This is where the spirit of confusion begins to grow, not as a single voice, but as a condition. Confusion is dangerous because it does not tell you one lie. It removes clarity so that multiple lies can coexist without being questioned. And in such an environment, deception does not need to shout, it only needs to offer answers. This is why, throughout history, times of global crisis often produce a flood of competing voices claiming solutions, interpretations, and revelations. Jesus is warning that the last days will not just be marked by physical instability, but by interpretive instability, people struggling to understand what is true, what is happening, and who to trust. And in that vacuum of clarity, deception thrives.
1 Coríntios 14:3 fez agora, the God of confusion,
But of peace. This reveals something essential. Confusion does not come from the truth, it comes from distortion of truth. And when confusion spreads, people begin to rely more on persuasive voices than on tested truth. This is where deception becomes global in influence. Not because everyone suddenly becomes evil, but because discernment becomes weakened under pressure. Jesus also warns that in the last days, deception will not remain private or small. It will become widespread in influence, affecting societies, systems, and thinking patterns. He says earlier in Matthew 24:11, "And many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many." This repetition of many again shows scale. The issue is not an isolated error, it is multiplied influence. False voices do not remain isolated for long. They attract followers. They build systems and spread ideas. And eventually, what begins as a small distortion becomes a widely accepted perspective. This is how deception matures, it expands. And as it expands, it begins to shape how people see truth itself. This is one of the most subtle dangers Jesus is warning about. When deception becomes so widespread that truth begins to feel unusual. When lies become common, truth can start to feel extreme. When error becomes normal, accuracy can feel suspicious. And this reversal is one of the strongest signs that deception has gained cultural influence. This is why Jesus consistently calls his followers to take heed, because in such an environment, awareness is the only protection against gradual influence. But Jesus does not only describe the danger. He also reveals the response required: endurance, discernment, and staying rooted. Because truth is not only challenged by false information, it is challenged by pressure to conform. And in a world where many voices say different things, the pressure to simply agree with what is popular becomes strong. But Jesus never calls his followers to follow popularity. He calls them to follow truth, even when truth is not loud, even when truth is not widely accepted, even when truth is not easy. And as this section of his prophecy unfolds, a world increasing in noise, instability, competing messages, and emotional pressure where deception is not just an idea, but an atmosphere. But within that atmosphere, Jesus is building something unshakable, a people who are anchored, discerning, and not easily moved by every wind of doctrine.